Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to the second event of our Spring 2021 series of West Hollywood Aesthetics and Politics lecture series, The Game of the Real, Art and the Knowledge Project. My name's Amanda Beach and I'm the Dean of the School of Critical Studies and faculty on the MA Aesthetics and Politics programme, which this series grows from. And first, I'd like to thank everyone at the West Hollywood Public Library. We would not be able to run this series without their generous support, allowing us to bring people together to address the stakes of philosophical, political, and aesthetic questions in culture and society today. Thanks also to my colleagues at CalArts for all their work, as well as you, the audience out there, for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it. And I hope you'll find this series of talks thought-provoking enough that some of you might want to interact with us and ask questions in the chat as we go on today. And the format for this series has been 3 sets of talks, each featuring 2 speakers. Our first session was held a few weeks ago, around a month ago, with Ana Longo and Tristan Garcia. And our next session after this will be on April the 29th with Maggie Roberts and Nandita Biswas-Melamfi. So I hope you can join us on April the 29th for that. And just on a side note, I'd like to point out and advertise the fact that our Centre for Discursive Inquiry at the School of Critical Studies does have a spring conference that will be online, remote, open to all, and that will be on April the 23rd and the 24th from 10 a.m. till 1 p.m. Over here in LA time. The conference is called Artistic Image, Scientific Imagination, Questions of the Political. And we've got a whole host of speakers, including Bassam El-Boroni, Fernando Zalamea, Luciano Parisi, Ana Longo, Ida Silar, and Thomas Moynihan. So I hope you will have time to join us, and more details will be on the CalArts Critical Studies website if you want to find out the links to join us for that conference. But today I have great pleasure in welcoming Boris, Ondreička, and Chiara Bottici to speak with us today, and each will speak for around 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time to open this out to the audience for questions. And just to give you some background to the whole series, each semester we explore a different topic, and this spring our theme is The Game of the Real, Art and the Knowledge Project. And as I've said before, this invites questions of the role of art in and as systems of knowledge and representation, how knowledge has been key to a project of emancipation, as well as how gestures against knowledge have claimed other freedoms beyond knowing altogether. And we will look at these issues in the context of a history of knowledge and its effects. Our attempts to know, explain, and grip objective reality objectively, or the task of knowing things as they really are rather than as they appear to be, we know this has revolutionized our understanding of a world out there. But at the same time, what we've learned has also revolutionized our self-perception, transforming conceptions of ourselves as free, self-determining beings to another view of ourselves as increasingly contingent, limited, one-dimensional, alienated, and dispossessed. We can see then how the discoveries of science from Copernicus to Darwin and beyond have altered our self-perception, but so has critical theory and philosophy. Here, critiques of modernity have defined the project of reason as ultimately an interface with its limits, in confrontations with the unknowable. And today we could say that many politicians, theorists, and artists have given up on reason and the project of knowledge altogether, where we cannot make fixed assurances between what is known and unknown, between what is real and what is appearance. And just to remind you that in our last event, Ana Longo spoke to the problem of capital and how the game-like system of our contemporary economy stands as the vector by which our future is organized. Longo's work brought up questions of how and if the understanding can denaturalize a system that insinuates itself as nature, a systematic ontology of forces that accommodates and thrives on deviance and subversion, and which problematically for Longo denies justice. And Tristan Garcia also discussed social organization via the question of representation, looking at the scene of the exhibition in what we might call the hyper-expanded field, for it's something that is constructed as much as by animals as by humans. And his work brought up questions of how exhibitions instantiate the presence of what is not correlated to our knowledge or perception, the object, and our role in engineering these encounters. Garcia's presentation posed the question of how the exhibition is not just an ontological description of life at work, but is held as politically necessary for a quality of life. Overall, in both presentations, questions of nature, organization, and power underscored the intense relation between subjectivity and objectivity, and how our understanding of them bears out in the social as decision, value, and meaning. And so now, with that in mind, I'm really interested to see how we can kind of expand and extend that kind of discussion to other fields and territories. And to move to our speakers today, I'd first like to introduce Chiara Bottici. Chiara is a philosopher and a writer, known for her philosophy of the political imagination and for her feminist writing. She is Director of Gender Studies and Associate Professor of Philosophy at the New School. And she is the author, among others, of Imaginal Politics, Images Beyond Imagination, and The Imaginary from Columbia University Press in 2014. A Philosophy of Political Myth, Cambridge University Press, 2007, and Anarcho-Feminism is forthcoming from Bloomsbury in 2021. Her short stories have appeared in Il Caffè Illustrato and Immaginazioni, I knew I would struggle with that, while her feminist experimental writing, Per tre motivi forse quattro, was published by Man Editore in 2016 and is forthcoming in an English translation with Bloomsbury. And her talk today is titled Imaginary Feminism. And now Boris Ondreička is an artist, author, and curator at Class of Interpretation Prague. He is former director of art initiative Transit SK and curator of Thyssen-Born Mithra Art Contemporary Vienna. He has co-curated Rare Earth, Olafur Eliasson, Green Light, an artistic workshop, and 6 seasons of the frequency of spoken word, Ephemetopera, all for TBA 21. Other curated projects include The Question of Will, OSF Bratislava, and Empire of the Senseless, Meat Factory Prague, Manifesta 8 Murcia, Cartagena, Being the Future, Palast der Republik Berlin, Germany, and Auditorium, Stage, Backstage, Frankfurter Kunstverein, Germany. His artistic projects have been exhibited at Bergen Assembly 2019, Manifesta 2 Luxembourg, Venice for the Czech, Slovak, and Roma pavilions, as well as for the Prague, Taipei, Athens, Kiev, and Jakarta Biennales. So with that illustrious kind of CV and bio from both our speakers, I'd now like to welcome Chiara to talk first. And I just want to say thank you for being here and welcome, Chiara.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation. My talk is called Imaginal Feminism. We live in a global society of the spectacle, and that spectacle is monocratic. Maybe patriarchy is declining, maybe men are no longer the single head of the family, but they're still the first sex. The attack on patriarchy has had its effect. The invention of plastic contraception and hormonal treatment separating sex from reproduction, along with the emergence of multiple wages households, multiplying the breadwinners within each household, have deeply changed the traditional family. And yet, after the frontal attacks to the family launched by feminism of different sorts, now, even within LGBTQ+ communities, and thanks to the legalization of same-sex marriage, the family seems to be back. However, what came back is clearly not the same thing that went away. This is the reason why we, Imaginal Feminism, propose moving from the category of patriarchy to that of menocracy. The latter signals that even in those contexts where there are no more patriarchs, cisgender men are still the first sex, whereas patriarchy literally means the rule, arche, of the male head of the family. That of menocracy points to the power, kratos, that men exercise in general. Menocracy can thrive even where patriarchy is declining. Women are still oppressed all over the world and all over themselves. In a time when the world has become a global village, when information and capital and viruses travel instantly worldwide, we cannot pretend we did not know. And so we know. We know that women are politically, economically, socially, and sexually oppressed. No matter which sources of oppression one will focus on, whether it's class, race, gender, empire, women are always on the bottom and men always at the top. There are many tools by which men exercise their privilege, but a useful, although temporary list includes the following: death, the state, the capital, and the imaginal. Death, because women are the object of a worldwide gendercide. The state, because the sovereign state is an instrument of the sovereign sex. Capital, because its economics exploit women more than men. And the imaginal, because global menocratic imaginary constantly reproduces images that are detrimental and oppressive for women. This is why feminists should fight the evil with a little bit of the same evil, the spectacle with another spectacle. In sum, this is why feminists should be imaginal anarcha-feminists. We invite you to navigate the global menocratic spectacle we're immersing, eat it, digest it, and spit it out in an unrecognizable form. Here are a few steps. First, women gendercide. The menocratic society of the spectacle tells us that there is a war going on globally, and that war is waged against women. Why are there more men than women on the planet, despite the fact that women tend to live longer? Where are all the missing girls? The missing girls are not counted in the hundreds or in the thousands, but they're missing in the millions. As of today, there are somewhere between 126 to 160 million girls missing from the global population, just as a consequence of sex-selective abortion, infanticide, gender violence, and inequalities of care. But violence against women's body does not stop after birth. 1 in every 3 women, according to UN statistics, has experienced herself such a violence, either in the form of physical or sexual violence, or very often a combination of both. Homes, as we learned during the COVID pandemic, are not safe for women and other gender minorities. As the lockdown went on, gender violence went up. Against women gendercide and all forms of violence against them, we anarcha-feminists call for feminism to become more imaginal and more anarcha. The liberation of women is the liberation of all. Either all women and all gender will be free, either we'll all be free from gender or none of us will be free. Second, the sovereign state is an instrument of the sovereign sex. Men are the sovereign sex because, like sovereign states, they do not have to recognize any sex superior to themselves. The world is currently divided into states, meaning that there's not a single piece of land where we can escape. So we're faced to live under state rule, which in turn also means that we're forced to live under men's rule. Across 149 states who agreed to show their numbers, women head of states were a meager 11%. Thus, it is largely men who decide what is legal, what is illegal, who, how, and when taxes have to be paid, who, how, and when employment is to be given, marriage is made, property inherited, healthcare assured, kindergarten built, abortion legalized or not. Given that we live under men's rule, are we surprised to hear that globally, women are paid in average 60% of what men get for the same job? No, we're not surprised. Does this mean that we should fight to have a woman president? No, this means that we should fight to have no president at all. We should not entertain any illusion. There cannot be a feminist state because feminism means liberation of all women and even the liberation of us from womanhood. And the state is a tool whereby a minority of people rules over the vast majority of them. But feminism cannot mean the liberation of just a few women. We have another name for it. It's called elitism. As Chinese anarcho-feminists put it more than a century ago, quote, when a few women in power dominate the majority of powerless women, an equal class differentiation is brought into existence. If the majority of women do not want to be controlled by men, why would they want to be controlled by a minority of women? End quote. Instead of competing with men for power, women should strive to abolish power, and anarcho-feminism is the best tool to do so because it is the best antidote against the possibility of feminism becoming simply elitism or even worse, white privilege. In an epoch when the election of a single woman as president or vice president is presented as liberation for all women, when people can turn feminism into a fashion brand, the fundamental message of anarcho-feminists is, in my view, more urgent than ever. Feminism does not mean female corporate power or a woman president. It means no corporate power and no president. Against the violence perpetrated by sovereign state in order to maintain the sovereign sex in its privilege, we anarcho-feminists call for the liberation of all, not one less. Either all or none of us will be free. 3, capital sins, or the sins of capital. If we liberate ourselves from the intellectual joke of state boundaries and take the entire globe as our framework, the first datum emerging is that people have not always been doing gender. And moreover, even if they did it on very different terms. It's only with the emergence of a worldwide capitalist system that the rigid gender binary dividing bodies into masculine men versus feminine women became so hegemonic. This does not mean that sexual difference did not exist before global capitalism, nor that capitalism invented patriarchy from scratches. It simply means that capitalism reoccupied the previous form of patriarchy, eradicated matriarchy where it exists, thereby giving menocracy a new strength and a new impetus. Capitalism needs women because it needs the assumption that women are not working when they wash their husband's socks and make their meals. It needs them to believe that they're just being good wives and good mothers. If a capitalist had to pay wages for all the cleaning, cooking, feeding, caring, babysitting, child raising, affective labor that good wives and good mothers do for free, then there would be no capitalism. But along with the extraction of free and wage labor from women, capitalism also needs to extract free natural resources from the environment and to create mechanisms to regulate the flux of labor. And this is the reason why, from the very beginning, capitalism has been inseparable from colonialism, land occupation, and ecological catastrophes. As a system devoted to the endless accumulation of profit, capitalism relies on boundaries to regulate the movement of labor and the extraction of natural resources, but it also systematically relies on racism to make sure that some bodies are more exploitable than others. This is where intersectionality is most evident, because being a woman of color means being exploitable in a way that cannot simply be explained by the quality of being a woman plus being a person of color. And being an indigenous woman whose environment has been destroyed and water poisoned means being exploited to a degree that no monthly check can ever pay back. Something very peculiar happens in those intersections of capital scenes, and that is where the coloniality of gender, according to Maria Lugones, thrives. Against this systematic intertwinement among capitalist exploitation, racial classification bodies, and gender oppression, against this boundary drawing that separate women from other genders in order to make them more exploitable, while destroying the environment we live in, we anarcho-feminists call for the liberation of all women. Not one less, either all or none of us will be free. 4, another woman is possible. At this point, one can ask, why insist on feminism and not just call this anarchism? If the purpose is to dismantle all type of hierarchies, should we not get rid of the gender binary, which opposes women to men, and therefore of the coloniality of gender that imprison us in a cisgender and heteronormative matrix? By drawing insight from an ontology of the trans individual, we anarcho-feminists respond that bodies in general and women's body in particular must not be considered as individuals, as objects given once and for all, but rather as processes. Women's bodies, like all bodies, are bodies in plural because they are processes constituted by mechanism of affects and association that occurs at the inter, infra, and supra individual level. Our bodies come into being through an inter-individual encounter. They are shaped by supranational forces, such as their geographical location, and they are made up by infra-individual bodies, such as the molecule we breathe, the hormones we englobe, or the images we ingurgitate every day. A woman comes into being not just through interactions, but also through intra-actions. Therefore, properly speaking, we're not, and we've never been, individuals. We are literally trans-individual processes, accidental sites for a process of becoming that take place at different levels. We are relations, not substances, processes, not things. Only if we consider skin boundaries as the ultimate boundaries can we classify bodies as males and females. But if we look beyond those boundaries and consider the totality of the cell comprising human bodies, we find out that 95% escape that dichotomy. Most of the living matter is actually queer. If and only if we adopt this trans individual's perspective, can we speak about womanhood outside of the modern colonial gender system and thus use that very term in order to include all types of women, feminine women, masculine women, trans women, female women, male women, lesbian women, bisexual women, intersex women, cis women, asexual women, queer women, and so on and so forth, all the way up to ways of being woman that have not yet been invented, because another woman is not just possible, it is also and always already begun. Against the violence perpetrated in the name of gender binarism, homophobia, and transphobia, we anarcho-feminists call for the liberation of all women, not one less. Either all or none of us will be free. 5, ecofeminism as queer ecology. Every being is endowed with the capacity to affect and to be affected, and that is how they strive to persist in their being. The notion of affecting is indeed central to a trans-individual philosophy. Within this framework, ecology is nothing but co-affectivity, whereas ecological thinking is nothing but the thinking of such co-affectivity as co-origination. This move prevents us from collapsing ecology into an all-encompassing organism where the whole determines its part. Co-affectivity is co-origination without anarchy, without a rule. Anarcho-feminism is co-affectivity, eco-affectivity, understood as a capacity to affect and being affected by every single being without implying any hierarchical organizing of such an infinite web of affecting. The notion of affect is thus central to a politics of renaturalization, where nature is brought back to the center of philosophical political thinking, but not as nature with capital letter, something that is capitalized at the very same moment that it is idealized, and thus sadistically made exploitable. This is the nature that leads to xenofeminism. An anarcho-feminist approach to ecology is one without nature in that alienated form, but through nature in its meaning of the unique infinite substance. An ontology of transindividuality enables us to both retain and distinguish between different individualities while according none of them any type of ontological superiority. Stones, not only cats or any other candidate for our animal chauvinism, are to some extent animate. Along with hierarchy, all rigid boundaries between man and woman, human and animal, animal and plants, life and non-life are also being questioned. A trans-individual ecology is indeed a form of ecology where industrial waste ceases to be outside of nature and becomes itself living organism, where the molecules we inhale or englobe become literally constitutive of our being, whether they're alive or not. In sum, it becomes a form of queer ecology. Many authors have noticed some affinity between ecology and queer theory, with some even stated and fully and properly, ecology is queer theory and queer theory is ecology. Both queer theory and ecology have a vocation towards questioning established hierarchies, classification, and rigid boundaries between the inside and the outside. But to question boundaries does not mean to eliminate distinction, nor to give up individualities. It simply means conceiving them as trans individualities. A trans-individual philosophy frames queer ecologies as one that examines boundaries and topples hierarchies while maintaining distinction. The reason for this is easy to see. If ecological thinking means that boundaries are abolished at any level, and that we are thereby invited to becoming, as Tim Morton says, open, radically open, open forever without the possibility of closing again, then not only do we end up in a night where all cows equally look gray, but also open the door for the idea that anything is therefore up for grabs by anybody. This is not only a caricature of queer theory, but also a dangerous move that justifies violence against queer bodies. To question boundaries does not mean to state that one is open forever and to everything. Although Morton's understanding of queer ecology problematically brings it to a terrain where most queer theorists would actually feel uncomfortable, it still points to a possible tension within queer theory itself. How to rethink the questioning of boundaries without ending up in a blind mesh where everything is available for grabbing, which is, I think, Tim Morton's version of queer ecology. The notion of trans-individuality can be very useful here, precisely to point out that emphasizing the inter, supra, and even infra-dependence of every being does not mean abandoning individualities and distinction. It means conceiving every individuality as trans-individuality, as the result of a process of affecting and being affected that takes place on multiple levels. It is a social ontology that enables us to perceive what happens beyond the threshold on somebody else's skin, but also one that does not invite us to violate that threshold if we are not invited to do so. against the violence perpetrated in the name of that contradiction in terms, which is green capitalism, against the menocratic hierarchy of man on top of woman, on top of animal, on top of plant, on top of inanimate matter, we anarcha-feminists state that all matter is to some extent animate. So there cannot be a liberation of women without a liberation of all matter. Not one less, literally, not one less. Either all or none of us will be free. 6, technologies of the self. The imaginal apparatus that sustained global menocracy has infiltrated every process of becoming woman. Women's bodies are everywhere the object of a process of disciplining whose purpose is not simply to govern bodies, but to instill in us the idea that our bodies need to be governed. Images and rituals of health, beauty, care change a lot from one context to the other, but they're everywhere globally, one of the most powerful sides for the exercise of menocratic technologies of the self. This is how docile subjects are created, not only through the imposition of the rules from the outside, but through the voluntary and at times even joyful participation in one's own submission. Imaginal fashion. Since the 19th century, that is the time of the emergence of factory and compulsory military service, European men have undergone what fashion theorists call their great masculine renunciation. Men gave up all the colors, laces, and fusses to wear the sober color two-piece suit that is worn today by any important man from Nairobi to Shanghai, from the first after college interview to the President of the United States. This has certainly increased men attire functionality as well as their solemnity, particularly when the jacket opens up to reveal that imponderable adornment hanging down in the middle of the chest and called a tie. By renouncing all other adornments, except the tie, men made it clear that they did not need any of them, precisely because they are already so important by themselves. Whereas women, who constantly need to prop themselves up, are constantly invited to carry all the burden of colors, laces, and fusses. It is women who constantly need to make up. Make up for what? What are they missing? Why are they the only one wearing makeup? Women carry most of the burden of care globally and in all the senses of the term, from childcare to body care, all the way up to healthcare. Women's bodies and sexualities are indeed medicalized and pathologized to a degree inconceivable in the case of men. Why are women supposed to visit a gynecologist once a year while most men can lead an entire life without ever having seen an urologist? Why do women's sexual organs need so much more checkups than men's? Are we assuming that something must have gone wrong just because they are women? And why are women's sexual organs mainly spoken of in terms of the vagina, which, as the Latin etymology reminds us, means the scabbard? The Christian God created the world by giving names, and since then, name giving has remained the sovereign act par excellence. Who has named women's genitals just a vagina? Why naming all that variegated space just a mere container for the sword? Where have the clitoris, the vulva, the pubis, the uterus, the labia all gone? Into the vagina. The whole is reduced to the part, and the part is the part that is supposed to give pleasure to the penis. This is not just a form of terminological reductionism. precisely because female genitalia are named as incomplete the way they are, precisely because women are supposed to do all the makeup. Women more compliantly undergo constant rituals of adjustment. They may vary across space and time, but are relentless in their disciplining effect. For instance, men rarely undergo complete body depilation. Women are increasingly expected to have all hair stripped from their bodies in order to be clean, desirable, and sexy. But why do we need to have hairless, prepubescent vulvas in order to be acceptable? If it is true that hairs appear on the body when we reach puberty, what is this imaginal order of prepubescent vaginas asking us? That we never reach puberty? That we look as if we were forever little girls? Can we greet this order and politely walk away from this menocratic spectacle? Probably not that quickly. From traditional foot binding to modern high heels wearing, the control of women's feet is yet another tool for discipline. Whether preventing from their natural growth in foot binding because small feet were said to be particularly attractive, or seduced into walking over painful high heels because by walking on pointy little penises, we are said to be more dressed up, women's feet never seem to be in the right measure. So we want to ask, why can men be masculine while wearing perfectly comfortable shoes, whereas women have to be in pain in order to be truly feminine? How have we come to accept the systematic association of the feminine with pain and suffering? Against menocratic technologies of the self, we anarcho-feminists call for a global liberation of women, literally head to toes. So we pledge to fight state fascism and plantar fasciitis, rape and osteoarthritis, phallocracy and metaralgia, sexual harassment and unions, brainwash and pump bump, unpaid housework and armor tolls, denial of abortion rights and bone spurs, gender pay gap and ankle sprains, feminicide and for animal stenosis, gender mutilation and stress fracture, lower back pains and cramps and spasms. In sum, we anarcho-feminists call for all women to be able to walk free. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chiara, for that amazing, what I can only call a tour de force, and also this description of oppression all the way down.
Head to toes, literally.
Yeah, exactly. And right the way through as well, we could say. And now what we'll do is we'll, without hesitation, move on to Boris. And then after Boris's talk, we can kind of come back together and all have a discussion. So thank you very much, Chiara, and welcome, Boris.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Many thanks for invitation. It's a pure pleasure to me. And yes, and you know, legendary Karl Arts and Walt Disney and Baldessari and Amanda Beach. So, and thanks to Chiara, this was fantastic. I will just give a very short spoken intro to a text which takes form of animated text or animated diagram. It's called Anti-Cosmic Materialism, and it is an intro to my rather extensive survey on the radical critique of culture I'm busy with these days. My motivation to dig the mythos as a base of the ethos comes from quite serious civic and personal discomfort with how democratic orders function. I believe that there is no chance to change the world by reconstruction of political systems, let's say nomos, cosmetics, cosmos only. I believe that we have to go deeper to reconsider the most fundamental features of culture. Let's say back to and before logos and cosmos, chaos. My main field of interest is the Mediterranean exchange in the frame of biblical writing and amateur analysis of fragments of later syncretic mashups, especially the book of Genesis, the role of Demiurgos played in Gnosis, especially Bogomil texts, and the work of parallel Jewish mysticism, especially the systems of Isaac Luria. Other source of non-linear inspiration to me is a black metal theory as formulated by Nicola Massiandaro, Eddie Connolly, or Scott Wilson, with contributions of Eugene Thacker and others, as well as all cultural studies as formulated by Christopher Patridge and others. Obviously, what I will show is no work of theory or philosophy. I'm just a fan of philosophy or history. It is, let's say, a poem. So let's play. Oh, there is some issue, so I hope you can find more patience. Just a second.
We have a small tech issue, as Boris just mentioned. And maybe Boris, if it's okay with you to just maybe I could ask you to introduce the piece, because as we introduced you, you were saying, you know, you come from having an artistic practice. And is this piece, I just want to know, have you shown this piece before?
No, it's a premiere.
Oh, okay.
We're good.
So
We're good. I'm gonna play
enjoy.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Boris, and we'll get to some questions after. I think we're ready now.
Yeah, thank you.
you're unmuted. Thank you so much, Boris, for giving us that presentation. And I could already see vectors between your presentations. But before we go into opening it up for questions, I was wondering, even though you've just shown your work, Boris, I was wondering if first you might have a question for Chiara and Chiara might have a question for you, just to see where we're at between your presentations, which of course had many differences. But as I say, I see certain trajectories that are working across both your pieces here today. So Boris, I'll ask you first. Do you have a question for Chiara at all, or want her to open up or expand on anything?
I have many questions to Chiara, but let's reduce it to one. We have, of course, like many items which we share in your speech, in my text. And one thing what makes me busy is this aspect of individual, trans-individual. And to me, to my poetic fantasy, if there is any individe, there's supposed to be some divide before, that something was divided. And this, like the aspect of individuation is to put it back together somehow. We have a parallel, like mirroring of this is in the word sex, which comes from secare, which means cut, to divide again. So, yeah, I mean, my question is like, yeah, we can trace the meters of Adam and Eve, or Eve and Adam. We can think that Adam was a neuter, let's say, not hermaphrodite, but let's say neuter, and divided to man and woman. So how this division, plays, or history of this division and indivision plays or can play a role in feminism or anarcho-feminism.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for pointing this out. I have not thought about sex coming from secare, so again a division. Yeah. So my first answer is to say it's clearly not by coincidence the fact that sexuality as a category was invented at the same time as the notion of the individual. Right, the two went together. They're part of the same obsession for naming, classifying, categorizing. Right, the very idea of sexuality as a separate sphere emerges with the creation of the various sexual pathologies, the invention of the homosexual as opposed to the heterosexuals. Before, it's not that before there were no forms of eros that correspond to what we could call today same-sex eros, but it was not thought in the context of a general individualistic philosophy that would attach to some people to certain forms of desire, right? So literally the creation of homosexual and heterosexuals goes hand in hand with the creation of modern individualism, right? So it's always this same process of classifying, which happens, that's why gender is also race and vice versa. At the same time, the classification of different forms of sexuality and genders happens when people around the globe are classified according to racial category. And that's also the same time when modern taxonomy, partly thanks to the work of colonizers, start to classify the different forms of life systematically according to certain hierarchies. So my answer is to say that the two go together. I've also often thought about why don't we just get rid of the notion of the individual? And, you know, in my work, I've argued we should get rid of the notion of modernity because it's so imbued with the idea of the traditional. So it works as a telos for classifying societies and people according to whether they're more or less developed. But the problem is the notion of individual is so entrenched in our language that we can't pretend that we don't have it, right? So for me, this ontology of the trans individual is the first step for overcoming individualism.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if I can raise a question in turn for you, Boris, I'm really intrigued by your concept of materialism, which I've been thinking about myself quite for some time. When I hear materialism, I heard matter realism. Also because being Italian, Latin, it was my first foreign language, and learning Italian, Latin, mater, which means the mother, right? So there's a play there. So matter realism is both the materiality of matter, but also the materiality of the mother.
Yeah.
Now, this clearly has very, I think, important symbolic, whether it's through psychoanalysis or through myth, it has a very important resonance. But I wonder whether, and it's a question that I have for you, but I also have for myself, I wonder whether this does good to feminism, right? To link materialism with motherhood. Is that not risking imprisoning, once again, feminism into a certain type of understanding of femininity, and in particular one that connects it with motherhood? So yeah, it's really a very open question there for you, and as well as for myself. On the one hand, I think it's important to have this resonance and to explore it. But on the other hand, I'm worried that it may bring with it a certain re-essentializing of femininity through motherhood.
I mean, it's a complex question. I think at the first, maybe we can meditate around the how can I say, maybe we can take the really adventurous etymological journey and ask ourselves if the matter as soil, earth, was the first or the mother.
Mm-hmm.
If because I think two of us, we have a very close to agreement that, let's say, it was the earth first. So in this case, I think we can get rid of any anthropocentric fixation of this like motherhood, and to be closer to like big nature, and it goes also hand in hand with this like Freudian, fear of monstrosity. So what is more monstrous, like earth or my mother? I mean, sometimes it's my mother, I have to say, mama, and also in various cultures and cultures from where we come somehow, even like temper of Italians is let's say, I mean, being a formalist, is different, like Mediterranean than our Slavic people, but we Slavs, we have a very close to Balkan as well. And the role of the mother in these societies, somehow I call it gray matriarchat, that there is a certain Schwarz economy of the matriarchat which stays behind and which somehow works with the machoism on manipulative basis. But that's definitely not feminism at all. You know?
Survival.
You know, it is a very strong and very like cryptic occult phenomena somehow, you know.
And I just have maybe a follow-up question before we go into the audience questions around materialism as well, because whilst not doing any etymology here, I mean, when we think of the word matter, we could also extend that to what matters to us, like what counts, what is valued, what means something to us. And we come back to the question of meaning. And when I say value, I'm not necessarily talking about capital, but in terms of social values, or even in terms of the critiques that you guys are proposing. And what I'm asking you really is, it seems clear that your worlds that work through processes, materialisms, are very critical, both of ontotheologies, idealisms, and yet, of course, you are talking about a world of nature, naturalism, and you've both talked about how you're kind of refusing, let's say, or resisting to idealize nature as a thing in itself that kind of holds up, like bolsters the critique, let's say.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in what you think about how your view of nature as intrinsic to your thinking, what its place is in terms of the political angle of your work, because in both of your pieces, there is a theory of cause, right? There is this impetus to change something, however that happens. And normally when we think of change in a kind of really traditional sense, in a metaphysical sense, we might think of that as one thing leads to another, cause and effect kind of situation, or means to ends, or teleological thinking. And you've both been really clear in your, critiques of that kind of idealist work, and also the metaphysics of that. So yeah, I'm wondering about when we originally set this talk series up, the kind of byline at the bottom was, dare we mention progress, after we've come out of all these critiques of modernity. And I guess it seems to me that whilst you've navigated very carefully the chaotic and pluralistic systems that we are entangled in today, and you diagnose them, and you also speak about nature, I'm just wondering about how this kind of direction that you also have in the work is kind of working through that description. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys, but I mean, if you've got anything at all to say about these kind of I guess different dynamics in the work.
I mean, maybe I can start, and I will somehow continue on this aspect of mother and nature. If Earth is mother, if it's Gaia, if it's Mami Wata, if it's Pachamama, then it's mother who does not care. It only gives, certain tissues which are fertile, and we have to work with them, There is not, I mean, if there will be a global nuclear conflict and humanity will be exterminated, it does not mean that nature will end, Nature doesn't give a fuck about the humans. Nature is fine with stones. So that's I think, extremely important to know, and to eliminate any vitalization and to eliminate any anthropomorphization of the ecological concepts. In the same time, also to me, to escape conservatism in ecology. So being not centered to preservation, because preservation means esoterical isolation, necessary esoteric isolation, but more to think about how we can make nature better. So to me, to start with, these days, more and more popular, like industrial ecology, is I think that's something what I'm very, I mean, I have a sympathy for industrial ecology.
So yes, I would add to this that I think I was trying to point out this two understanding of nature. One is what I call, the alienated nature as this thing that is separated from culture and society. And the other is the way in which I use the term nature, inspired by this strange Marano philosopher who was Spinoza, as just synonymous with a unique substance. So this unique substance that Spinoza also calls Deus sive natura, right, is a God in the sense that it's what enable us to get rid of the God, enable us to get rid of the idea that there is this guy in the sky with the beard that at some point was born, and that we will start to consider time as a linear sequence after that act of birth, okay? Now, if you question that understanding of God, you also question that linear temporality, in my view. So I think the trans-individual ontology I'm working with is also ones that question the idea that time is this linear sequence of individual events. The understanding of the relationship between cause and effects that began with modern physics and modern science is the idea that A is a cause of B if event A is the necessary cause, is the necessary reason for the existence of the event B, right? But if we understand in a trans-individual philosophy, if we understand individualities as never given individuals, so the relation, if you want to rethink the notion of causality, you always have to think of it in terms of an infinite web and network. So it's never A to B to C to D, but it's a multiplicity of web of affective relations that you need to reconstruct. Now, this ontology also clearly brings with it a completely different temporality. Now, in a very radical Spinozist direction, time is just an illusion. It's a human illusion. We need to wake up in the morning and we need to think that there is a certain order, which, by the way, the most immediate order would be cyclical. I get up every morning and there's the sun, and then the sun goes down. But we have inherited, interestingly enough, from one single temporality, which is the Christian and the monotheistic temporality, this idea of a linear time, which has now become hegemonic. Like most of the identity papers around the globe mention dates starting from the birth of the Christian God, okay? That's the beginning of our era. Now, why is that the case? I think, and here we're back to capital, that is the case because capitalism as a system that is predicated on the endless expansion of profit needed a linear understanding of time, right? We need to think that there's going to be this endless expansion of profit, that we can exploit natural resources infinitely. We need to think that our debts will end at some point and we will be rewarded. In capitalism is a perversely utopian system because it's always predicated on what is not yet there. So it goes very well with the idea of linear temporality and a sequence. So to respond to your question, do we even dare to mention progress? I think we should mention, but also be aware that progress begins at the moment we get rid of progress.
Thanks so much, Chiara. That both of you and Boris, they're great responses. And I've got a question in the chat that came in, which relates to you both, actually. So the first question is, how does Boris's video disrupt, reconfigure, or even run roughshod on, quote, name giving is the sovereign act par excellence? And that's from Chiara's talk. That's a quote from you, Chiara. So there's a question here about how does let's say the production, the poetics, the configuration of your video, Boris, critique sovereign nomenclature, or even speak to questions of nominalism, perhaps. And then, so maybe you could start, Boris. It's a question about your video, and I'm sure Chiara has a response too. Thanks.
No, I mean, the video has like parallel lines. There is some historical, like from the foundation of the world to nowadays. And then there are different like degrees of progress of construction of self. And it's about the language being the only ladder or rope to go back, to return. So I hope it's a piece of answer.
Well, I see that as a process of reclaiming some form of sovereignty by giving up sovereignty, in the sense that I do think that naming, I mean, it's not me, it's whoever wrote the Bible, who decided that naming is the first sovereign act par excellence, and I do believe so. But we see also as renaming is actually a process for disrupting that going on, which I think is what drives me crazy within the two-spirit LGBTQ plus community. There's a constant proliferation of naming. And it's a constant proliferation, which I think is an attempt to disrupt modern nomenclature. Like the fact that modernity operates by giving a name to everything. Every form of life has a name. Every species has a name. And those names, the ID papers that we carry with us, enable us to be governed. They assign us a name, which interestingly, most of the time as first names, last name, correspond to given name and family name, right? So there is already an order there, and it's an order we bring with us all the time.
Can I ask you,
such as materialism is a way, in my view, to attempt to subvert and insert into a term materialism, which, for instance, we all associate with a certain type of orthodox Marxism, right? Historical materialism, which is as historically focused on forms of class of exploitation that did not take into account how gendering went together with class formation. In your workplace, you're both gendered and classified into a class, right? The class comes with a certain gender.
Yeah.
So I think Boris was attempt. It's one of reappropriate this naming.
And I'm wondering also, from what you're saying, Chiara, and in relation to your work, Boris, that I'm wondering about the quite a traditional thing I'm going to say now, which is said about art quite a lot, is that art being synonymous maybe with terms like the event, perhaps it calls into it calls people into a situation where naming is required. It asks for naming, and I'm wondering if that's also something that comes up in your work, that there's a kind of space that's created that calls upon a language to name it that is not yet ready or something like that. But I don't know if that's how you see it, Boris.
I mean, at the first, new phenomena need new words. Then the new also means like a mashup or, syncresis of different things. So name is also an aspect of differentiation, which I think these days is extremely important, because I mean, let's just trace all of these new brands in alternative right-wing politics, of last decade. It's like enormous, generative process of the very subtle differentiation in between different wings, So at the first, to me, it is, of course, language is a significant of a property of discovery, differentiation, and in the same time, as I said, it gives us a chance to return back, because we can climb down, through the history of the language, through etymology, etc., etc., etc. Obviously, what also earlier this evening Chiara mentioned is an aspect of translation, which in the many cases in the history was extremely manipulative or even benevolent. So etymology is no science. So
thanks, Boris. And I'm going to just jump. I know we haven't got much time left, but I want to get to these questions as they're coming in. Okay, I'll try and read this. And it's also in the chat here if you guys want to follow. Chiara, how does the view that men's rule over women began and persisted even today, due to men's desire to control women's capacity to gestate children, possibly for property inheritance, relate to 21st century feminism?
Right. Well, that's that needs a whole book to be written. So, okay, how can I respond quickly? The central point here is what I would say is the control of reproduction. What do I mean by reproduction? I mean the fact that production, including the production of commodities like properties to be heredited, is inseparable from the existence of reproduction. Okay, so as women have historically been the bodies that had this capacity to carry life, the disciplining of the capacity to give birth has been one of the, no doubt, one of the central site for the exercise of patriarchy. If there's if there is one place that is today highly medicalized, but before in every form of society highly ritualized, is all what concern women reproductive faculties. I mean, from menstruation or to birth giving is extremely regulated. So the problem is that most of the time, when we think in terms of production and productivity, this reproduction gets out of the picture. So that's why I think it's important to speak about reproduction in a way that brings in not only women reproductive capacity, but everybody reproductive capacity. Because I mean, now with in vitro fertilization, even reproduction itself is changing in nature, without considering the fact that not only reproduction is not necessarily sexual, like actually most of the living cells in our body don't produce to sexual reproduction. Reproduction is rather asexual most of the time, but it's also, in a way, it also applies well beyond the human. in general, the living matter is queer in terms of reproduction. So yes, that's not a full answer, it's the beginning of an answer, but I do think it is central to what the question is asking, to rethink reproduction, if you visualize that reproduction with the re in parentheses, you realize how much the re is bracketed usually. And so we think of production without that, which also means thinking about reproduction without including the productive capacity, not only of certain bodies, female bodies, but also the reproductive capacity of plants, animals, and other living beings.
Thanks very much, Chiara. And I know we've only got just a few minutes left, so I'm going to go to this, which should be our last question today. And I'll read it. It's from the chat. And it says, in practice, if we are engaged with a, quote, right to opacity, end quote, to quote Glisson, and also want to communicate something, the dullness of certain knowledge acquiring tools, for example, can you speak to the potential risks of gentrifying anarchy on the one hand, and romanticizing an innocent, uncorrupted point of origin when drawing out new imaginal maps or poems? So maybe just because you've talked just then, Chiara, I'll go to Boris first to see if you've got anything to say about that.
I think we both try to escape from the question of origin. That's why there is this anarchy. And to escape from maybe from the territory of demand. So I don't think that there is any romanticizing of an innocent. Plus, you know, earlier this evening, I started this like, how can I say, like polemics on indigenous or aboriginal and etc., which implies a different risks of radicalization. So yeah, I think, yeah. Chiara?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can just add to this. I think, as we mentioned before, when we were discussing question about anarcho-indigeneity or indigenous anarchism, I think it's important when one think about indigeneity to think of it in terms of land dispossession. Nobody was ever there ab origine. I don't think there is an origin in that sense, in an anarchist perspective, but there are struggles. And so you can understand indigeneity and indigenous claims in terms of claims that began with land dispossession. So indigenous are those who were there when the land was dispossessed. So in this sense, I think that indigenous anarchy is also anarcho-indigeneity is also a form of anarchism without origins, as Boris was saying. And maybe I can also say something about the right to opacity, because I think the question was also mentioning that. And we talked a lot about naming and what Boris was doing with his talk in playing with etymologies, inventing new words. So certainly there is a way to struggle by renaming. And I call my talk Imaginal Feminism and claiming it that since we are immersed in this monocratic spectacle, women are all bodies who are the second sex should dismantle this monocratic spectacle by enacting another spectacle, which also means inventing new names and renaming. But I also think that it is important to vindicate the right to opacity, so the right of the unnamed, remaining unnamed, being anonymous, at times is also a site for resistance.
Yes, but this is also, this is one of the problems of also the notion of being no one of Thomas Metzinger.
Yeah.
Actually, all forces of society are trying to eliminate this chance.
Yes.
You can't be no one,
Yes.
In 1980s, there was this book written, which is called, and it was a manual. It was called How to Disappear Completely. In 1994, this book was thrown to the garbage because it was actually impossible. So you can't disappear.
Yeah.
You need to have name, you need to have number, you need to have account, and whatever, So being no one is impossible.
And if you do not have the papers, other people represent you.
Yes.
As being without.
Yes.
So even in that, there's a kind of hierarchy of representation. So you're not beyond the conditions of any system.
Right. But opacity is not being no one.
Yes.
I do think that being no one actually is a great strategy and impossible to be, but always worth trying, being no one. But opacity is different. Opacity means not to be completely legible.
Yeah.
And that is a good strategy too. I mean, there are many fights. Opacity is a great tool.
Yeah, sure.
And I think that is really an interesting kind of point to end on, because it highlights this difficulty of, maybe it's something that I referred to before when I was talking about Boris's presentation, but the difference between creating a language that is yet to be understood and calls upon the intelligence or calls upon the understanding, and something that tries to resist like what it sees to be the hegemonic or normative conditions of what is given. And I think that these are they're not the same thing necessarily at all. And it brings that question up, that old question up between like resistance and construction, that I think is in both, that hovers around both your papers as well. But now I will look at the time and say we have to finish. And I will also thank both of you profoundly for your amazing presentations, and also for the audience for their brilliant questions, which have really like pushed us a little bit further. I hope that we'll all meet back here in at the end of April for to see Maggie Roberts and Nandita Biswas-Melanfi to kind of expand this a little bit more, still within the field of philosophy, politics, and the arts. So thank you everybody out there today, and hopefully we will see you